This is a nickel briquette, 6 inches of compressed metal, silvery gray, weighing about 2 pounds. Costs roughly $38 at today's prices. Seems unremarkable, another industrial commodity in a world full of industrial commodities. Until you realize that this briquette is the bottleneck for every electric vehicle, every grid storage battery, every portable electronic device on Earth. Without nickel, lithium-ion batteries don't work. The cathode chemistry that makes modern batteries energy-dense requires nickel in quantities no other element can substitute. And 3 days ago, Indonesia decided the world has been paying too little for too long. On January 23, 2026, at 9 a.m. Jakarta time, President Prabowo Subianto signed the National Resource Sovereignty Act, legislation that bans all exports of nickel ore and nickel intermediates, effective in 30 days. Not quotas, not tariffs, a complete prohibition. Indonesia produces 55% of the world's nickel, more than half of global supply, controlled by a single nation, now forbidden from leaving Indonesian shores unless it's been processed into finished battery cathode materials inside Indonesia. The legislation doesn't just restrict exports, it redirects global battery manufacturing. Every company that wants Indonesian nickel must now build Indonesian factories. Every supply chain that ran through Indonesia must now terminate in Indonesia. This is not a trade policy. This is economic coercion on a planetary scale. And the global battery industry has 30 days to figure out how to survive it. Here's what they're not telling you. Indonesia's nickel dominance isn't geological accident. It's deliberate strategy executed over 2 decades. In 2014, Indonesia implemented its first nickel ore export ban, a measure that seemed economically irrational at the time. Why restrict exports of a resource that generates revenue? Western economists predicted the ban would harm Indonesia more than anyone else. The prediction was wrong. The ban forced nickel processing to relocate to Indonesia. Chinese smelting companies, facing ore shortages, built Indonesian processing facilities rather than lose access to the world's largest nickel deposits. By 2020, Indonesia had transformed from a raw material exporter to a processing hub. The 2020s accelerated the transformation. Chinese investment in Indonesian nickel processing exceeded $30 billion between 2020 and 2025. New smelters, new refineries, new chemical processing plants, each facility making Indonesia more central to the nickel supply chain. But processing wasn't enough. The new legislation targets battery cathode production, the final step before nickel becomes a battery component. Indonesia isn't content to export processed nickel. They want to export batteries. At 11:30 a.m. Jakarta time on January 23rd, I obtained a copy of the implementation regulations through a source in Indonesia's Ministry of Investment. The regulations clarify what the legislation requires. Export permits will be issued only for finished battery cathodes, NCM and NCA chemistries, manufactured in Indonesia with minimum 70% Indonesian content, finished battery cells containing Indonesian-produced cathodes, finished battery packs assembled in Indonesia. Everything else, nickel ore, nickel pig iron, nickel matte, nickel sulfate, mixed hydroxide precipitate, is prohibited from export regardless of destination. The regulations create a simple choice for battery manufacturers: build Indonesian factories or lose access to 55% of global nickel supply. At 2 p.m. Eastern on January 23rd, Tesla's stock fell 14% on the news. By market close, it had fallen 21%. CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, fell 18% on the Shenzhen exchange. LG Energy Solution fell 16% in Seoul. Panasonic fell 12% in Tokyo. The market understood immediately what the regulations mean. Battery manufacturing costs will rise. Battery supply will tighten. EV production targets, already strained by other material constraints, become unachievable. At 4:30 p.m. Eastern on January 23rd, I spoke with the chief supply chain officer at a major EV manufacturer. She agreed to speak anonymously. We have 6 months of nickel inventory at current production rates. After 6 months, we're dependent on whatever Indonesia decides to allow. Our entire production plan for 2027 is now uncertain. I asked about alternative nickel sources. Alternatives exist, but not at scale. The Philippines produces nickel, but lower quality and lower volume. Canada's nickel is mostly committed to existing contracts. Russia's nickel is sanctioned for most Western manufacturers. Australia has deposits that are years from production. Indonesia is the only source that can supply global EV production. That's exactly why they can do this. I asked about relocating manufacturing to Indonesia. We're already discussing it. Everyone is. But building a cathode plant takes 3 years minimum. Building the supporting infrastructure, power, water, logistics, takes longer. Indonesia is demanding we build factories in 30 days or lose supply. It's physically impossible. They know it's impossible. The impossibility is the point. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The global EV industry was built on the assumption that nickel would flow from wherever it was cheapest to process. That assumption treated resource-rich nations as raw material colonies, grateful recipients of whatever price the market offered, passive participants in supply chains designed for others' benefit. Indonesia rejected that role. The 2014 export ban was the first rejection. The 2020's processing investments were the second. The 2026 cathode mandate is the third and final. Indonesia isn't negotiating for better terms within the existing system. They're building a new system with themselves at the center. President Prabowo articulated the strategy in his signing ceremony speech. For too long, Indonesia has been the foundation upon which others build. Our nickel becomes their batteries, their vehicles, their profits. The wealth that should develop Indonesian communities develops foreign shareholders instead. This era ends today. Indonesian resources will create Indonesian industry, Indonesian jobs, Indonesian prosperity. The speech received standing ovations from Indonesian legislators. It received panic from global manufacturers. But the panic is misplaced if directed at Indonesia. Indonesia is doing exactly what economic logic suggests, using leverage while leverage exists, capturing value while value can be captured. The panic should be directed at decision-makers who built critical supply chains through nations with every incentive to demand more. At 8 a.m. Singapore time on January 24th, the major trading houses convened emergency sessions to model nickel market impacts. I obtained the modeling outputs from a source at one of the houses. The projections are severe. Nickel prices. Current spot price, $17,800 per metric ton. 30-day projection if ban holds, $28,000 to $32,000. 90-day projection, $38,000 to $45,000. The projections assume some Indonesian supply reaches market through exemptions or smuggling. Without that assumption, prices have no ceiling. Battery cathode supply. Current global production, approximately 2.8 million metric tons annually. Indonesian share, 41%. Post-ban supply gap, 1.15 million metric tons annually. Enough cathode material for approximately 15 million EVs that will not be produced. EV production impact. Global EV production in 2025, 18 million vehicles. 2026 projection pre-ban, 23 million vehicles. 2026 projection post-ban, 14 to 16 million vehicles. The ban doesn't just slow EV growth, it reverses it. Timeline to recovery. If Western manufacturers immediately begin Indonesian factory construction, first production reaches market in 2029. 3 years of supply shortage, 3 years of elevated prices, 3 years of EV production constraints. The modeling assumes manufacturers comply, that they build Indonesian factories rather than seeking alternatives. The alternatives are worse. Substituting nickel with other cathode chemistries requires reformulation and recertification that takes 18 to 24 months. Lithium iron phosphate, LFP batteries, don't require nickel but have lower energy density, reducing EV range by 20 to 30%. Developing new nickel sources takes 5 to 10 years from discovery to production. The nickel deposits exist in Australia, Canada, Tanzania, the Philippines, but the mines don't. Recycling recovers nickel from spent batteries, but the volume of batteries reaching end of life is tiny compared to demand. Recycling might supply 5% of nickel needs by 2030. Every alternative is slower, more expensive, or lower performing than Indonesian nickel. Indonesia knows this. The legislation exploits it. Less than 30 days separate today from the export prohibition taking effect. The countdown creates artificial urgency that serves Indonesian negotiating objectives. Manufacturers facing 30-day deadlines make hasty commitments. They announce Indonesian factory investments before completing due diligence. They sign memoranda of understanding that lock them into Indonesian terms. The haste benefits Indonesia. Commitments made under pressure favor the party applying pressure. At 10 a.m. Jakarta time on January 24th, Indonesia's investment minister held a press conference inviting foreign manufacturers to partnership discussions before the ban takes effect. Indonesia welcomes global battery manufacturers who wish to participate in our industrial development. We offer streamlined permitting, tax incentives, and access to the world's finest nickel resources. The opportunity is available for 30 days. After 30 days, The opportunity belongs only to those who committed. The language frames coercion as opportunity. Manufacturers aren't being forced, they're being offered a chance. The framing is propaganda, but effective propaganda. By noon Jakarta time, representatives from Tesla, CATL, LG, Panasonic, Samsung SDI, and BYD had requested meetings with the investment ministry. The queue for appointments extended into February. The manufacturers will negotiate. They have no choice. The only question is how much Indonesia extracts. While manufacturers scramble, the geopolitical implications crystallize. Indonesia's export ban reshapes not just commercial supply chains, but strategic dependencies. China's battery industry is least disrupted. Chinese companies already dominate Indonesian nickel processing. They built the facilities during the 2020s investment wave. Chinese manufacturers have existing relationships, existing contracts, existing facilities that provide advantages Western competitors lack. CATL and BYD will negotiate Indonesian terms from positions of relative strength. They're already there. They've already invested. The ban hurts them less than it hurts competitors who remained offshore. The competitive dynamic shifts toward China by default. American and European manufacturers, forced to build Indonesian facilities from scratch, lag Chinese manufacturers who expanded existing operations. At 3 p.m. Eastern on January 24th, the U.S. Trade Representative issued a statement calling the Indonesian export ban a matter of serious concern and announcing consultation requests under existing trade agreements. The consultation process takes months. Indonesia's ban takes effect in 30 days. The legal framework moves too slowly to prevent the supply disruption it's supposed to address. At 5 p.m. Brussels time, the European Commission announced emergency review of critical mineral supply chains and potential countermeasures under trade defense instruments. The countermeasures are empty threats. Europe imports no significant goods from Indonesia that could be restricted without harming European consumers. Indonesia exports nickel, which Europe desperately needs, and palm oil, which Europe has already tried to restrict for environmental reasons. There is no proportional retaliation available. Indonesia calculated correctly. The leverage is asymmetric. Europe needs Indonesian nickel more than Indonesia needs European markets. The strategic implications extend to military applications. Nickel-based batteries power not just consumer EVs, but military vehicles, drones, and portable electronics. NATO's military modernization plans assume battery availability that Indonesia's ban jeopardizes. At 7 p.m. Eastern on January 24th, a Pentagon spokesperson confirmed the Department of Defense was assessing implications for defense supply chains, but declined to provide details. The assessment will be grim. Defense applications receive priority allocation, but priority allocation of insufficient supply still means shortages. Military procurement competes with commercial procurement for constrained nickel resources. What the informed understand is that Indonesia's nickel ban represents the maturation of a strategy that other resource-rich nations are studying closely. The strategy has 3 phases. Phase 1. Restrict raw material exports to force processing relocation. Indonesia implemented this in 2014. The ban caused short-term revenue loss but achieved the strategic objective. Phase 2. Restrict intermediate exports to force advanced manufacturing relocation. Indonesia is implementing this now. The 30-day deadline forces commitments before alternatives can develop. Phase 3. Restrict technology and know-how to maintain processing dominance permanently. This phase comes next, requiring technology transfer, joint ventures, and local content that ensures Indonesia captures not just current production, but future innovation. The strategy works because it's patient. Each phase builds on the last. Each restriction seems tolerable compared to the alternative. The frog boils gradually. Chile is studying Indonesia's approach for lithium. The Democratic Republic of Congo is studying it for cobalt. Australia is implementing elements for rare earths. The resource nationalism wave is building, and Indonesia just demonstrated how effective it can be. At 9 p.m. Jakarta time on January 24th, President Prabowo gave a televised address elaborating on the ban's strategic rationale. Indonesia has 270 million people. We have the world's nickel. We have the world's palm oil. We have the world's tin. For too long, we exported resources and imported poverty. That exchange ends now. If the world wants Indonesian resources, the world will build Indonesian industry. Our children will be engineers, not miners. Our grandchildren will own factories, not dig in them. The speech was populist, nationalist, and economically accurate. Indonesia has been undercompensated for its resources. Indonesian minerals have built foreign wealth while Indonesian poverty persists. The correction the legislation attempts is morally defensible, even if economically disruptive. The disruption falls on those who benefited from the previous arrangement. The nickel briquette weighs 2 pounds. It contains atoms forged in supernovae, concentrated through geological processes spanning billions of years, extracted from Indonesian soil by Indonesian workers. Those workers earn approximately $400 monthly. The battery containing their nickel sells for $15,000. The EV containing that battery sells for $50,000. The wealth gap between Indonesian miners and Western consumers is the gap the legislation addresses. The address is crude. Export bans are blunt instruments. A more sophisticated approach might use export taxes, processing requirements, or negotiated voluntary export restraints. But crude instruments work when sophisticated alternatives have been ignored. Indonesia asked for better terms for decades. Western manufacturers offered token improvements while extracting maximum value. The ban is the response to being ignored. $17,800 per metric ton today. $38,000 to $45,000 per metric ton in 90 days. The price increase transfers wealth from battery consumers to nickel producers. Some of that wealth reaches Indonesian workers, Indonesian communities, Indonesian development. The transfer is inflationary for EV buyers. It's developmental for Indonesia. Whether that trade-off serves global welfare depends on whose welfare you're measuring. 30 days until the ban takes effect. 90 days until supply chains break. 3 years until alternative supply develops. The timeline describes the cost of dependency. Dependency built over decades, exploited now, unavoidable until alternatives emerge. The nickel briquette sits in a warehouse in Sulawesi, waiting for export permits that will not arrive. The battery it would have become will not be manufactured. The EV that battery would have powered will not be produced. The consumer who would have bought that EV will buy something else, or nothing. The cascade from Indonesian warehouse to global consumer takes 30 days to begin. Indonesia's nickel monopoly is now Indonesia's nickel weapon. The weapon is aimed at everyone who assumed cheap resources would flow forever. Cheap resources require cheap countries. Indonesia decided not to be cheap anymore. The briquette weighs 2 pounds. The leverage weighs $5 trillion annually. And the global battery industry has 30 days to learn what leverage means. The countdown started 3 days ago. The factories in Indonesia will be built, eventually, expensively, on Indonesian terms. The question is, how much breaks before they're finished? The answer is, quite a lot. The nickel briquette doesn't know any of this. It's just metal. But the world that needs it is about to discover that just metal can reshape industrial civilization. 30 days.